an alien concept. 3 days later. Both men locked eyes with one another as they were marched to the posts at the center of camp in restraints. Montano's torso was still wrapped, and Alaron's arm had long since healed. The matter was still unsettled, so the hatred in both's eyes was erupting like never before. However, both were fully ready to bleed, to be lashed, and to have their backs opened in the name of Caesar. The feelings of animosity in both men were essentially serving as a last hurrah, in honor of a poison inside them that they loved feeding but were ultimately looking forward to ridding themselves of. That feeling was indulged by the two as they marched between the formation of the 6th Legionaries. The two locked eyes with each other the entire time, paying no mind to their assembled comrades, the slaves at their stations, or even the tribal girl named Clara, who stuck around the camp like the loyal pet of one man. Shoved into the posts by members of Montano's contubernium of veterans, Montano himself wasn't spared from their harsh treatment, as his arms were stretched and bound around the post. In fact, Montano admired them for treating him like the filthy failure to Caesar he felt he was at the time. He knew that he was only 50 lashes away from being back in the favor of Caesar and looked forward to the pain. As Alaron was restrained to the post, the only thing going through his mind was also his readiness for the righteous pain about to be endured. No longer would he entertain the notions of savages who duel their own brothers, or even fall victim to the offer. He was 50 lashes from being redeemed after a simple moment of weakness, and that weakness was begging to pour out. Once both were in place, they kept their eyes on the other, knowing it was likely to be about 10 lashes in where the gazes would break, and any amount of hate for the other would disappear by the intake of a pain both longed for. The shadows of the punishers soon shaded both men, and moments later, the tails of justice were raised when a foreign sound instinctively lowered them, even going so far as breaking the lock over the men's eyes. That noise was that of a horn announcement just outside the camp. The wind slowed, and the silent formation behind the two did not move. But the sound of heavy footsteps from many men sounded louder and louder. The sound continued for several more seconds, and both men hadn't been whipped once. Just as Montano's veteran was about to begin the work on Alaron, the voice of Centurion Thericos sounded from behind demanding a halt to the punishment. Both men eager to be punished, they broke their gaze again to try and see what the holdup was. Neither could see from how tightly they were restrained to their posts. But the thudding of those footsteps came to a stop, and voices were heard behind the two, only to be quickly buried by the wind picking up again. The confusion enveloped both men, so much so that they forgot the hate for one another. Instead, their eyes pleaded with one another for some kind of explanation, figuring that the other might have a better angle to see what was happening behind them. Suddenly, the two whip-holding veterans stepped away, taking their shadows with them. More confusion until Alaron and Montano could do nothing but look at one another and continue to internally question what was going on. The silence was unbearable, and the two had eventually come to feel that the entire world disappeared while they were still restrained to those wide wooden posts, only able to see one another. Just then, the world came back in the form of a new long shadow standing between the two, and not the shadow of a lasher. The shadow had a large fan of feathers across the top of its head, making the men assume it was their centurion if it wasn't for the slimmer frame. The men continued to watch the shadow between them until it stepped closer, the posts being no more than 5 feet apart. Montano and Alaron didn't know what to think as the focus on that shadow was replaced by the appearance of its owner taking a knee between them. Neither Alaron nor Montano had seen this person before, and it was then that both had realized who he was. The 6th Century had been waiting near Gold Canyon for weeks on their new elite commander to arrive before marching south. A subtle detail they'd always known in the back of their minds, but was always lost in the day-to-day and the new feud that consumed their worlds. It wasn't until the elite was kneeling between them that the two men remembered who exactly the 6th was waiting on. Montano and Alaron had heard of the Interfector of Phoenix, the murderer of Phoenix, or the killer, but didn't know what to say as he knelt between them in a silent world. The murderer shifted his focus casually between the two restrained men without any expression on his face. Both Alaron and Montano felt embarrassed, almost fearful of the man between them, and for good reason too. The two honestly thought the man didn't appear like much. He didn't have a terrifying presence, or the scars and burns marking triumphs in countless battles. Still, neither the condemned could shake the embarrassment or fear they felt in the direct presence of such a man, especially in their situation. The murderer between them was an average frame man, wearing the standard garb of a centurion, with heavy metal shin and knee plates, and torn crimson cape stretching down his back from his shoulders to his knees. The big identifier on his uniform was the thick brown old-world ballistic vest, patched with steel, and with what appeared to be a red bird crudely painted in the center. Atop the man's head and above a rather scarless but dusty face was a dirty black old-world helmet with a lifted shattered visor and a symbol of a golden S with a wreath around it marking the front. Along the top of that helmet was a wide fan of crimson and black feathers with 3 golden ones on the ends and the center. Where the new commander lacked in a terrifying appearance, he made up for in reputation, name, and those solemn symbols of a civilization that never even existed in Caesar's eyes. After all, both were there for the fall of Phoenix only 4 months prior. With time stopped as the man shifted his gaze, Montano and Alaron remembered the fall of Phoenix. They saw the dark nights in the desert, while siege engines launched flaming boulders at an already flaming city. They saw the city burning beneath the night sky, hearing the screams of distant people, and hearing the gunshots from Phoenix defenders killing their Legion brothers on raids against the outer city. Both remembered the giant walls of the city where thousands of soldiers stood or shuffled to and fro, equipped with dishonorable weapons, and ready to oppose Caesar. They saw the tall towers with old-world mechanical turrets that spat fire and bullets, embracing the inferno behind them, and ready to repel whatever attack the Legion could throw. All those memories reminded them of a feeling that Alaron, Montano, and probably every other legionary had when facing the metropolis of Phoenix. That feeling was the first time any legionary felt scared of the enemy in front. All those battles, skirmishes, and conquests over tribes across northern Arizona didn't prepare Alaron, Montano, or any soldier in crimson to face the impenetrable wall of Phoenix, or the thousands of its soldiers and allies set to die opposing Caesar's will. The enemy they faced made Alaron and Montano question the authority of Caesar for the first time since swearing their allegiance to him. They remembered their brothers falling to the guns or being reduced to cinders by those old-world turrets and studied their own weapons, asking another first-time question. What even is honor? As many as the Legion were that surrounded Phoenix, Montano, Alaron, and everyone else knew that they were all going to die whenever they moved on that wall of guns and lasers, and die for Caesar like dogs without glory or prestige. In the Legion, there was nothing honorable about being a martyr, or being slaughtered before getting close enough to even swing a blade. Nobody who wore crimson wanted that kind of death, and feared being slaughtered like a dishonorable wretch more than dying itself. The only true distinction about who gets the honor in a giant bloody mess is who exactly gets slaughtered. With the line ready to die against the walls of Phoenix, the fear of being killed in a humiliating way disappeared one morning on the 5th week of the siege. As the sun began to glimmer over the eastern mountains, the walls of Phoenix erupted in fiery explosions, tumbling and collapsing into an enormous cloud of dust that gave way to the piercing screams and gunshots of a city ripping itself apart. The organized and well-armed opposition to Lord Caesar diminished into a display of pure chaos. As the dust cloud grew and grew, Montano, Alaron, and the entire 6th century were ordered forward into the cloud by their centurion. The 6th, 11th, 13th, 7th, and 10th calmly marched forward while the rest of the line held fast. Not one legionary or officer knew what happened, what was happening, or what to expect. Through the dust and ruins of the wall, and below the smoke of the burning city, the legionaries breached the perimeter to see everyone who'd been organized against them not more than 40 minutes previously, all killing one another in the streets. The civilians panicked, scattering in every direction and pleading for someone to trust when their defenders were all killing each other. With nobody to trust, the people of Phoenix fell at the feet of the soldiers in crimson, begging to be spared and saved from a city that turned on itself in an instant. Alaron and Montano both watched the scene, tallying and escorting the populace of Phoenix into a life of slavery as the dust cloud settled and the gunshots became fewer. Not one legionary within the walls of Phoenix knew how to explain the origin of the event they arrived to, with many in red occasionally saying that Mars himself exploded the walls and created the chaos. Many were inclined to agree until captives of the oasis saw the water of the canals dry up, flow to a halt, and disappear with the emergence of the Arizona sun. Montano and Alaron began to notice more and more captives from the metropolis showing up at the tables equipped in armor with the red bird or black armor marked by the golden S. Certain defenders of the metropolis met with legionaries explaining how they were with people whose names were unknown but supposedly worth mentioning to the victors. The erasing of Phoenix from history and the puzzling situation the Legion soldiers arrived to gave rise to many questions that nobody but Caesar or Legate Graham could answer. Fortunately, orders from Legate Graham himself came to all the sentries around Phoenix to segregate the surrendered defenders and praise the Interfector of Phoenix. Believing that to be the new title of Caesar, it wasn't long before word was spread between the captives, with the slaves all damning that person, and the pleading defenders all begging for his pardon. All who bowed to the Legion that day were very clear that the killer of Phoenix wasn't Caesar. In the weeks that followed the fall of Phoenix, stories were spread between legionaries who apparently served under the killer, and the legend became more real as more was revealed about the nature around the entire event. By the time the murderer of Phoenix was kneeling between Montano and Alaron, all they knew of the murderer of Phoenix was that he used to be a soldier who fought Caesar but ultimately bowed to his superiority. His title came from Graham, but the slaves of Phoenix knew who he was, and with more word about his actions spreading throughout the Legion, Caesar took less credit for the annihilation of Phoenix, while the murderer took more. The man was imagined to be an 8-foot monster covered in the scars of war, a man who could create explosions and turn friends into traitors with his mind alone, a man who'd wear the title of a killer of whole civilizations with pride. The man kneeling beside Montano and Alaron didn't necessarily fit with the legends and stories. The man might have worn the armor, wore the symbols of the conquered, but that emotionless face beneath the identifying plume of Caesar's, particularly favored, appeared withered with lines of stress. The man had a face that didn't mark death for Caesar's enemies, but a face that couldn't be understood by Montano or Alaron, a face that really said, "What's done is done." The trance of recollection and intimidation from who was between them ended when the wind picked up again and the murderer of Phoenix said the words, "What have you two done?" The question didn't come like that of any other centurion or officer reprimanding the soon-to-be punished. Instead, the question came calmly from the man's steady mouth, more curious than anything. Neither man responded, unsure what to say. After enough silence, the murderer smiled, looked at the ground, and chuckled, saying, "There's still so much to learn." He ended his smile, straightening his mouth and making eye contact between both men as he continued, "It's okay to speak. I have authority over Theracos here." Still, neither man knew what to say as their faces were still pressed to the wooden posts. Letting loose a small sigh, the calm-faced elite locked eyes with Montano before asking, "Is Centurion Theracos correct in saying you were injured during a fight?" Montano looked to Alaron, whose face remained steady, expecting a smug grin that never came. Montano's eyes then shifted to the murderer as he said, "Yes, Centurion." A small silence ensued, until the Interfector asked Montano in that same calm tone, "May I take a look at your wound, Decanus?" Never having been asked permission for anything by someone who outranked him, Montano wasn't quite sure what to say or do in that instance either. Montano's eyes even shifted to Alaron's, seemingly begging for the correct answer. A fruitless effort since Alaron hadn't even heard the calm question over the wind and wouldn't even know what to respond with anyway. The only thing Montano could do from his position against the pole and confusion at the nature of their elite commander was give a pained groan. After the noise, the murderer gave a slight nod and reached toward Montano's chest. The commander lifted Montano's tunic, adjusted his head for a better angle under the restrained man's wrapped injury, and squinted his eyes upon seeing what he was looking for. Montano's tunic was lowered, and the commander turned his face to Alaron. Silence again as Alaron and the commander studied one another. As the Interfector's eyes scanned up and down the bound frame of Alaron, Alaron himself took a special interest in the man's almost sunken eyes. If Alaron had known what compassion was, he'd have described the face of the murderer in that way. Instead, Alaron too didn't know what to even think about the man with the more features he studied. The lines in the commander's face made him appear to be about 50 years old, but the man's average but muscular frame and the rest of his body said he was no more than 30. Still, Alaron couldn't explain just about anything regarding the figure who was responsible for the death and enslavement of so many thousands. A man who'd essentially saved Alaron's life by doing whatever he did to the wall and people of Phoenix, if those vague stories were true. Suddenly, it occurred to Alaron that he wasn't supposed to even look at the face of a superior unless authorized to do so, especially from a place reserved for disobedient slaves. Alaron hastily shifted his eyes from the commander, and in an instant, the murderer of Phoenix asked, "Veteran Decanus Alaron?" "Correct." Alaron's eyes met the man's, who nodded in permission to respond. Alaron spoke in military but dehydrated tone, "Yes, Centurion." The tone of Alaron's words came out in a way that made the commander assume Alaron didn't know who he was talking to. Alaron realized this, and in a quick attempt to correct the possible perception of ignorance, the murderer cut off that attempt by a soft grin and the calm words, "Good to meet you, Decanus Alaron. I am the Interfector of Phoenix, or so they tell me." The murderer smiled like centurions of the Legion never did, and this confused Alaron, who was the only one who could see the man's face. When the Interfector's eyes met Alaron's again, he asked the restrained man, "I understand you and Decanus Montano fought one another while you were attempting to carry out your Centurion's orders." Alaron nodded from the post, and the killer squinted. There was another pause before the killer said, "It would appear as though the matter settled itself. Montano got injured for defying the order, and you were only attempting to defend yourself. I'd say his injury alone is just for the dilemma, and if your arm was injured, I see this matter ended." The Interfector stood, and Alaron's eyes widened even though he was the only one who heard the words. Alaron heard them all right, and panic entered the man's mind for almost the first time ever. "I have to be punished. Montano has to be whipped as well. Both of us failed Caesar in our actions. Please let us bleed." Those were Alaron's thoughts that he wouldn't dare utter to one of the Legion's elite, despite the cool and understanding tone of the man. Montano didn't hear the words, so he didn't understand the panicked expression on his rival's face until the killer turned around, motioned for the men with whips, and gave the order. "Untie them, both of them." Montano heard that, and he too joined his rival in mental panic, with his only thought being, "I have to be punished." Alaron and Montano both stared at one another at a complete loss as the veterans unbound the two from the posts without a single lash on their backs. Their arms fell to the sand as they stood, still facing the other. Upon turning to face the sixth, they saw the Interfector of Phoenix standing in front. Behind the man of legend was the whole sixth still in ranks, Centurion Thericos, and an additional 200 legionaries behind the sixth, identifying themselves as the 9th and 5th centuries. Montano and Alaron looked at the mass and turned to the new commander of the Southern Campaign when he said, "This matter is over. Both of you might have been wrong in some form or another, but that doesn't mean your damned backs should be opened. You two screwed up. Fine. I don't care. Just don't let this shit happen again. I hope you two might have learned something from this. Mercy isn't such a bad thing if you can help it." The two walked back to their century as the new arrivals readied themselves for a march. As they walked with the Interfector, they thought of his words, knowing how powerful he was, but bewildered in what they were supposed to learn from escaping the whipping post. The commander of them, Thericos, the 6th, 9th, and 5th said the matter was over, but nobody in that mass of crimson knew what mercy really was. In an event where blood was supposed to be spilled, mercy wouldn't end something that could by the crack of a whip and tear of flesh. Already Set in Motion Part 1. 2 months later. Smoke poured into the sky all across the war-torn desert as Alaron stood upon the ridge top. The sounds of battle pierced the distance while Alaron shifted his eyes from the giant bloody mess in the middle to the slowly approaching mass identified as an Ajoan counterattack. Centurion Armin of the 5th shouted in order, and the column of veterans of the 5th, 6th, and 9th centuries began their quick march to intercept the Ajoan reinforcements on the desert plain as a string of loud gunshots burst from the primary chaotic brawl. Just then, the urgent voice of Decanus Gula entered Alaron's ears. "Alaron, follow." Alaron turned from the distant battle to immediately join the entourage of Centurion staff officers headed by the prime commander of the Interfector's personal guard, believed to have been called Prime Decanus Dalton at the time. Alaron joined his senior, Gula, on the urgent walk as more of the staff legionaries at the camp were called to join the entourage all the way to the command tent. The 16 officers entered the tent and approached the center where the killer paced back and forth in a frustrated manner. The commander stopped his pacing when all had entered, and paused with his hands on the table when Centurion Gallio of the 9th approached. The killer looked to the man calm and expectingly when Gallio spoke. "My Primus, the veterans are moving to intercept the reinforcements, but the situation in the center has us taking heavy losses." Seemingly continuing an argument or conversation from before the staff arrived, the Interfector interrupted, "And if we don't intercept the savages' backup, our center will take even more losses." Gallio spoke in respectful disagreement with his superior. "Lord Interfector, if we fall in the main battle, the veterans may be too fatigued or suffer too many losses to even reinforce the center. If the veterans become too bogged down in the counterattack, they may not even have a center to reinforce by the time they get there." The Interfector's face turned from a listening expression to another strange mix, resembling something of frustration and understanding at the same time. The commander said, "Well, the order to intercept was already given, Gula." "Yes, Primus," said Alaron Sr. "You had Decanus Alaron pass the order to Centurion Arman, correct?" asked the commander. "Correct," said Gula before the Interfector instantly turned to Centurion Gallio and said, "So what you're saying is that timing is key here." Centurion Gallio responded, "And strength. The sooner that force is dealt with, the less chance we have of losing our entire center, and possibly even this fight." The Interfector's face was locked in concentration for only a few long and drawn-out seconds before saying in frustrated but calm demeanor, "Well, get out then. Fall out outside, all of you." Not sure what was happening, but instinctively carrying out the order, all the staff soldiers automatically began to file out the entrance, while the Interfector's orders were detailed in the form of an authoritative voice over the shuffle of footsteps. "Dalton, you take the staff corps and have them bolster the veterans' interception. Gallio, have someone run word to your scouts around the center, have them do what they can from range, and bring up one of our auxilia units to keep distant and fortify our ranged troops. I need 3 lines of guns doing everything they can to keep our center alive. Dalton, ensure this counterattack is taken care of fast." The staff officers who'd normally graduated from places on the front lines in exchange for general military administrative duties were not always spared from getting into the sandpits of desert warfare. Of course they knew this, but it wasn't often that a battle was in such a situation to order their desk jockeys in other armies into the fray. In the Legion, nobody was safe from ending lives or getting sprayed with blood in the name of Caesar, something the staff officers of Legion units everywhere longed for after gaining their more cushy position. Despite the terrifying nature of the strategic position, the commanders of Caesar's southern campaign found themselves in the desperation of it, and order into the carnage was celebrated by each staff officer including Alaron as they formed up outside. The prime commander of the killer's guard, Dalton, took the head of the small staff force, and they all began a running march through the camp toward the war-torn desert plain. Across the camp, slaves led by tribal auxiliary troops came from the distant battle, hauling the Legion casualties back to camp in an effort to heal or salvage from the fallen. A row of wounded or dead legionaries lined the wall of the forward healing tent, where the 6th Sgramma lifted each soldier's head, briefly checked for life or death, swore over the distant screams of battle, and moved right along. Alaron followed in the loose formation right behind Dalton, the prime who gave the order to sprint upon passing the last of the camp's outer tents. The 16 stormed across the desert floor, keeping distant from the primary fight, marking the center at risk of falling. Their tribal auxiliary gunners charged out beside the staff reinforcements, veering off to establish the Interfector's line of guns, and Alaron focused on what was ahead. Dalton the Prime had shifted the staff north, where they saw the solid column of veterans slowly approaching the swarm of Ajoan reinforcements. With the veterans being the only obstruction between the fresh Ajoans and the dire situation of their center, Prime Decanus Dalton had positioned the staff to smash into the Ajoans' flanking force. The staff slowed their sprint upon getting closer, and the sounds of carnage were louder than ever. Decanus Dalton was seemingly slowing for ranged fight when the tightly packed veteran formation met with the flanking Ajoans. Just before the clash of steel, Alaron saw the front line of veterans unleash a volley of lead, while a couple dozen spears came flying out from the back of the formation. The spree of gunshots from the front ended when the swarm of Ajoans stormed over their fallen and smashed into the veteran formation. Alaron was fixated on the battle, despite being in the middle of reloading his repeating rifle. Having no memory of being given the order to fire, he was one of thousands in the Legion able to act upon orders with his mind being anywhere else. The line of guns to his left and right thundered, and Alaron began instinctively firing again, as he watched Ajoans climbing over their brothers in the front line and flinging themselves into the middle of the veterans' formation. The veteran formation began to break as more and more Ajoans threw themselves on it from above, and the whole thing turned into a chaotic mess. Decanus Dalton saw this too and gave the roaring order to charge. Alaron threw his rifle over his back and drew his blade dipped in rancid blood as he and the other staff veterans began to storm into the battle. Several Ajoans on the outer edge noticed the staff charge forth, but by the time they did, it was too late, and Alaron slammed himself into one of them. On the desert floor, Alaron saw the petrified face of an enemy taken off guard and lodged his blade into the man's head. He whipped around to find himself in the middle of the fight, with masked legionaries in red, all engaged against vicious tribal warriors covered in tattoos and bedecked in wood and leather armor. Though nearly impossible to tell who was who, Alaron had been Legion long enough to know it was Gula, who was the soldier swinging the fire axe around his head, keeping 4 tribals with spears at distance. Though the Prime named Dalton was another unknown, due to his relation to the Interfector, Alaron could tell he was the servant of Caesar who slid a machete out of an Ajoan's stomach and began calmly reloading a high-tech-looking dusty pistol. He also recognized a few of his colleagues in Centurion Thericos' staff, but a thought that hadn't entered his mind in weeks finally did it in that moment. Where's Decanus Montano? Of course, Montano was in charge of the 6th Contubernium of veterans. The 6th veterans would have been in the middle of the intercepting formation. Alaron didn't have much longer to think about anything when an Ajoan warrior was declared victor against a newly killed veteran legionary, and thought Alaron would be the next victim. As the tribal charged Alaron through the chaos, Alaron picked up a sledgehammer off the desert floor and swung the heavy steel block behind him, ready to turn the charging tribal into paste. Only that didn't happen. When Alaron brought the heavy weapon behind, he felt it crack against something made of solid and reinforced plastic. Against all instincts, Alaron turned around mid-fight to see who he hit. There in the dirt, Alaron saw the fan of feathers indicating a Legion veteran Decanus slowly standing to his feet with the side of his helmet and part of his plume smashed inward. Not anything critical, but certainly enough to knock a sturdy and muscular veteran to the ground. Time again seemed to slow as Alaron watched the Decanus rise. Upon lifting his head, the Decanus scanned the one who'd knocked him over and saw Alaron standing there with the sledgehammer still slightly raised. Alaron saw that his accidental blow had knocked the goggles covering the man's eyes completely off his unintended victim, and upon meeting those eyes, he knew Montano. In an instant, after what felt like forever, Alaron remembered the Ajoan charging him, whipped around, and saw the man had been tackled by a nameless veteran before reaching Alaron. Just as he was about to turn back to Montano, or find a new Ajoan to kill, someone slammed into Alaron. Thrown to the ground and completely disoriented, Alaron's wild vision returned when he was rolled over, and there he saw Montano sitting atop him with his face exposed. Alaron's dirty goggles were torn from his head, and he saw Montano's sneering face beneath a nearly totaled helmet. Dust choked Alaron as he felt the pressure of Montano atop his armor and saw that face scream the words, "Couldn't leave me be, worthless dog." Suddenly, a handful of sand was slammed into Alaron's eyes, and he could no longer see as he felt blow after blow land on his face. The deafening mix of screams, clashing steel, and gunshots of battle got steadily quieter as each blow struck Alaran's face. He felt his nose burst, his cheek crack, and maybe a tooth or two slide into his dust-coated throat. Unable to do just about anything, Alaran's face was continually beaten as he swung his machete around wildly, not sure if the parts of Montano he did hit were of damaged in any way. Blow after blow, Alaran stopped feeling, and his attempted defense was growing weaker and weaker while the sounds around him got quieter and quieter until darkness. Alaran thought he spent a long time unconscious, but in reality, it was only a few moments after Alaran passed out that Montano ended his assault. After which, Alaran came to almost immediately, and felt the weight of Montano get hauled off of him, and senses slowly began to return as his mind sparked steadily back to life. Alaran felt himself getting dragged by some unknown person, until his sense of hearing returned. The battle against the Ajoan's flanking force had ended by the sounds of things, though the battle in the center was still going strong. Upon hearing that, Alaran heard the distinct voice of Decanus Gula barking in a seemingly incoherent way, and felt the arms dragging him stop. Just then, Alaran felt warm water pour over his eyes, and his vision slowly returned, but was still blurry by a newly swollen layer of skin around his eyes. More water was poured over his eyes, and he heard the voice of Prime Decanus Dalton sound from right above him. "Bring up Centurion Arman. Can you see anything, Alaran?" Alaran's throat was still coated in dust, teeth, and blood, but he managed to sputter an assurance and nod before Dalton lifted a canteen to Alaran's mouth. Alaran looked straight ahead while his vision refocused, and even more senses returned. He felt the continuing concussion but painfully looked around to see the remainder of the veterans and staff reorganizing, amid the corpses of Legion and Ajoan alike. Alaran was stuck looking forward 10 yards from him, where all he could really see was Decanus Montano sitting in a similar upright position, but restrained by 3 large legionaries, and with Decanus Gula marching back and forth, sputtering incoherent anger. Though he couldn't clearly see the face of Montano, Alaran could imagine his grin upon looking at the work he'd done to Alaran's face. None of that mattered when Alaran heard the heavy footsteps of someone and heard the winded words of Centurion Arman. "Prime, you called for me. I take it you have further order from our Dominus." Dalton responded as Alaran's head slumped into his own chest. "Yes, Centurion. Take your veterans and the rest of this staff and move on the center. Fast." Centurion Arman began to march to the head of the surviving veterans when he stopped and said, "Decanus Montano, get up and take your place." Montano started standing when Decanus Gula interrupted. "Centurion, I am to see Decanus Montano and Alaran here back to camp, by order of Centurion Therakos." In that moment, the Centurion head of the cohort's veteran reserves really saw the situation beside the newly assembled remainder. His eyes flipped from Alaran, whose face was battered into oblivion, and Montano, who was standing, but still restrained by 3 veterans. Arman's face switched from study to rage as he shouted, "I have no time for this. Fine. Get them out of here, and have the killer move a detachment of auxilia to bolster our right." He motioned to the soldiers restraining Montano and shouted, "You 3, fall in. Gula, you and Dalton see those 2 back to camp. Ensure they're crucified." Prime Decanus Dalton responded, "Yes, Centurion," as Arman stormed off to lead the rest of the veterans and staff. Alaran barely heard any of that as a new wave of pain came over him and began struggling just for consciousness. Montano was released from the grip of the 3 legionaries, but was ordered to move by Gula, who held him at pistol point. A nearly unnecessary gesture since Montano had resigned himself to whatever Centurion Therakos had in mind for such a relapse. Whether it was crucifixion, some lesser torture, or even time in the slave pens at some distant Legion outpost, Montano casually walked back to camp in front of Gula, and beside the unconscious man and on the Prime's shoulders. Montano felt finally satisfied. Already set in motion Part 2. As Montano and Alaran were brought back to camp, the 2 were thrown into a hastily built cell divided down the middle by a set of bars and constructed flimsily to temporarily contain recent captures. The cell could be broken out of by a strong man with enough effort, an act that was deterred by a guard out front, a tribal auxiliary in that particular case. The divided cage was in sight of the command tent, but nothing happened when Gula and Dalton entered it. Nothing happened after the two exited either, but after they did, the Interfector and Centurion Gallio emerged moments later. Gallio didn't do anything other than round up a few passing legionaries and bark some indistinct order. The Interfector, on the other hand, stood outside his tent, caught eyes with Montano, shifted to the unconscious Alaron, made his frustrated face completely emotionless, and proceeded to walk out of sight with an entourage of auxiliaries. Montano collapsed into a corner of his tiny cell, looked at Alaron past the divider, and closed his eyes to the ongoing sound of battle. 4 days later, the battle was over only another hour or two after the incident with the Legion on top. The counterattack was defeated by the veteran wave and minor staff force. As the combined group of veterans regrouped, it wasn't long before the storm strayed into the mass around the weakening Legion center. With all Ajoans focused on the bulk of primes and recruits, the veterans slaughtered everyone where they stood till the Ajoans were too covered in their friends' blood to hold a weapon. The Ajoans who were previously overwhelming the center began fleeing in every direction once it was clear they were losing, only to be picked off or detained by the spread lines of auxiliary Legion gunners. Once the center was free, and the veterans regrouped, the formations were ordered as more scouts and gunners dispersed to continue their Ajoan roundup. Atop the corpses, Thericos took tally of his remaining prime and recruit combined wave. Between the 300-plus auxiliaries, recruit, prime, and veteran legionaries who fought in that center, only 122 were still standing. But around them were nearly 700 to 800 Ajoans lying either dead or too wounded to fight anymore. As the company of legionaries and slaves watching the camp moved up, they began bringing back the injured, while Legion runners moved up to pass word to the Interfector. The messages and reports came to the killer, but it was unnecessary since he stood on the cliff watching the whole thing. Small bushfires still poured their smoke into the sky, while the formation of his remaining soldiers shuffled to and fro, stepping over the dead. Beneath the smoke and beyond the corpse-covered sands was the Ajoans village with hundreds of civilians crowding the outer edge of town, trying to make out who had won beyond the haze. The Interfector knew he won, but the devastation of his forces was almost enough to be a defeat. With the display before him, he remembered something he read about in the Legion's Flagstaff library during his leadership training. The name, King Pyrrhus of Epirus, came to his mind, and he now knew what it meant to win a battle at the expense of a campaign. Still, the murderer's response to the messenger was to march on. Over the next hour, the remainder of the killer's forces marched through the smoke and into the Ajoans' village before they could start running. There, the process began. The Legion rounded up everyone, sick, elderly, women, children, boys, men, and anyone who wasn't killed on the field. Hours passed as the process of assimilation went on. Well into the night, the Legion raided the Ajoans' homes for food, supplies, weapons, hiding persons, and anything that could be used before the homes and structures were set ablaze. The remainder of the forces and commanders back at camp shifted to directly organize the procedure in the conquered village. Pens were made as slaves moved the dead of the field back for looting. Tribals from the pens were brought out in groups to be assessed by the centurions or veteran officers for health and used to the Legion. Most of the sick and elderly were killed by primes before getting tossed into mass graves nearby. Supplies were tallied, women were put in chains, girls were marked with red X's on their tunics and segregated from their families, while the same happened to the boys. The sick were disposed of, and those left were locked into their place, waiting to be judged whether or not they'd have a place in their new post-Ajoan world. The fires of the region grew brighter as the sky got darker, and the only ones back at camp were Alaron, Montano, and the auxiliary guard. When morning came, the assimilation was still going strong, but the fires were dying, and there was still so much work to do. The murderer really felt angered by the losses he took, and seeing how many troops he had compared to the amount of Ajoans he captured, he knew this situation was not the greatest. Still, he consolidated every soldier and slave in the village and sent a veteran explorer out back to Flagstaff with news to Caesar, as well as a request. The Interfector ordered the dismantling of the Legion camp on the second day, and so the remainder of his cohort section, and nearly 1,000 new slaves, rebuilt their camp atop the ruins of the Ajoan home. Alaron and Montano were allowed to walk to the new camp at escort, where they were then ordered back into their cells with nothing to look at but each other and the process they were so familiar with, but forced to sit out on. There, the two sat, while the assimilation was carried out, and the Interfector's remaining force began the transition to a simple wait for further orders. A wait that could take many days, if not a week or two. There were too many captured Ajones and too few legionaries to begin a flowing assimilation, something that was a mix between escorting captures to distant legion camps while readying to march during normal circumstances. Instead, the days slowly drifted on while the Interfector's troops could do nothing but stand watch over the mass of conquered Ajones. By the fourth day, things had slowed down enough to where the murderer could remember the situation regarding two of the lowly officers under his leadership, and how he had to deal with it eventually. As the assimilation went on, the Interfector had passed the cell of Montano and Alaron many times, always going out of his way to ignore it, and seeing the whole matter like two kids in timeout for not getting along. The fourth day was when it was finally time to deal with it. The morning of the fourth day, Montano was sitting in his cell with Clara on the other side of the bars, occasionally handing bits of fruit to him. All the while, he was doing what he'd done since getting back in his cell, shifting his focus between Alaron, who'd been conscious since the day after the fight, and the slave pens. Montano and Alaron both felt beyond humiliated by the fact their cells were far smaller than the slave pens made of barbed wire holding hundreds. Montano watched while a few legionaries tossed handfuls of food into the pens for the slaves like they were feeding chickens. Montano felt superior to the slaves only by the fact that he had a personal servant feeding him. It should be quickly mentioned again that Clara was not a legion slave. However, after the first duel between Alaron and Montano, she was escorted to the 6th camp for interrogation. From there, she merely stuck around and saw to the man wherever he went since the fight. It wasn't normal under any circumstance for citizens of recently conquered legion towns to stick around legion camps. But the woman named Clara, whose residence she offered Decanus Montano back in Gold Canyon, was a unique person. Nobody knows what she saw in Montano, or what their relationship was exactly, but she offered herself into legion servitude as a personal attendant to the man. Though she was the young officer's personal servant, even on the march, the emergency situation after the fall of the Ajoans meant she wasn't spared from having to do her part in the recovery, healing, and construction work of the unit's average slaves. Still, she took her occasional free moment, seeing to her confined Montano while glaring at Alaron. When Clara ran out of snacks to feed her man, the two sat there for several minutes in silence. Although, it wasn't more than a few moments later that the 6th's grandma stormed over and began shouting at Clara to go do her checkups at the wounded tent. The young woman shrank into herself as she stood, while the old grandma began fidgeting with the lock on Alaron's side of the cell. As Clara began walking off, Montano lazily said in feigned protest, "You can't order my slave, or servant what to do, grandma." Clara began to turn around with a smile at the prospect of more time next to her man, but grandma replied, "She ain't yours no more, Montano. While you're in that cage, she's mine." Montano grinned as grandma turned the lock on Alaron's cage. "Slaves can't own property, grandma." "Yeah, I can. I take great care of my slaves. Just 'cause I'm legion property don't mean I ain't still a witch queen. I used to have 100 slaves," said grandma before noticing Clara had actually turned around and stopped. Montano couldn't see, but he knew the face Clara made when grandma shouted at the woman to do those checkups. A smile crept across Montano's face when he heard the young woman who idolized him get routed by the elderly slave healer. Grandma knelt down as Alaron straightened himself up for the checkup, and Montano couldn't see much other than the healer prodding what looked like Alaron's eye. Montano paid no mind, and instead just watched the slaves in the nearby pens while Alaron's checkup continued. Alaron had his cheek cracked and open, while his eyes were beaten to near blindness. Since their fight, and after waking, Alaron was only barely able to see, and not because of optic nerve damage. The bruising had made his eyelids swell to obstruct his vision, and the savage beating had cracked his jaw, broken teeth, and tattered his lips, though the swelling and damage had recovered much by the fourth morning, although there was no denying that the man still looked as though he'd been recently killed. Grandma had finished her duty, only shaming Alaron a little in the process. As she stood up, She began shuffling out of his cell and locked the door behind her. Both men watched her leave without a word, and began taking in the same view of those slaves in the pens with legionaries all pacing about to their assigned tasks. Another 2 lifeless hours passed. Clara visited Montano when she could, but the two hadn't moved but an inch. When the sun was high above, the heat created a haze that could be seen only yards away wherever there was sand. The two had seen a number of Jones or new slaves succumb to the heat over recent days since the battle, and even during those passing hours that 4th day, as evidenced by the occasional crew of legionaries that went in only to come out with a body. Montano and Alaron both remained somewhat thankful for the hard wood covering over their cell, but the other part of them felt they didn't deserve the minor convenience. Another slow hour passed when the Interfector finally arrived outside their cell, something they'd forgotten to think about given the neglect they'd experienced since entering confinement. Both men watched the commander approach, and tagging along was Centurion Therakos and Decanus Gula. Before stepping to the cage, the Interfector stopped, turned around, and began quietly talking to the Sixth's leaders behind him. Montano and Alaron were ready for their fate, and ready to learn it from the leader of this finished Ajone campaign. They could imagine the killer was asking them for suggestions on how to kill or torture them. It was then that the two thought back to when they were strangely spared from the whipping post. After that, they'd been marching for days, leading in 3 other battles, burning 2 other villages, and finding themselves in another conflict with the other. All events seemed only a dream after days in a cell marking their failure. Montano and Alaron still didn't know what to make of their mercy from the whipping post, and sitting in those cages during the fall of the Ajones' last settlement gave them plenty of time to think about that again. They remembered Centurion Armin ordering their crucifixion after their part in the battle, but no word ever came of that, even by the 4th day. Of course, punishment was at the Centurion's suggestion, but Armin wasn't theirs, Therakos was. Neither man had seen or gotten to speak to Therakos, since he only passed them a few times in recent days, only to ignore their existence for focus on assimilation matters. Neither man had an idea what to expect from a man whose jurisdiction over the duelists' feud was apparently taken over by the Interfector since the whipping post. When their quiet talk was over, the Interfector turned back around and stepped closer to the cage while Gula and Therakos remained where they were. The Interfector stopped only a foot from the cage and knelt down between them. The sun glimmered off his polished black helmet and soot marked that lifted visor with the lone bullet hole. Upon taking his knee, the man took off his tall and heavy helmet, better showing his dirt, sweat, and battle-marked face that winced at the sunlight. The man shifted his eyes between the two and studied the men in their shaded combined cell. Neither man said a word, even after the commander wiped the sweat from his brow and said, "Oh man, sure is hot out here, wouldn't you say?" To nobody in particular. Montano and Alaron stayed silent, looking at the man who resumed shifting eyes between the two with an emotionless face. After a moment, the killer's eyes land on Montano's just before asking, "Do you want to explain your side?" Montano remained silent again, since questions from superiors were almost always rhetorical, despite the nature of the Interfector whom all Legion officers had come to understand as something unique. Same question was asked to Alaron, who at least had a more physical reason not to speak, having a cracked jaw and missing a few teeth. The murderer stayed quiet a moment, and nobody had said anything. Seemingly knowing the minds of Alaron and Montano, he said, "I'll tell you what I know, and correct me if I'm wrong." The two looked at him while he resumed. Veteran Decanus Alaron and veteran Decanus Montano of 6th century, under Centurion Therakos, took a mercy of mine and threw it in the trash. I gave them the opportunity to escape lashing by an agreement to end whatever feud there might have been between them. And then they repaid me by fighting each other again in the middle of a battle we were on the verge of losing. He paused, and none of them moved. Seeing the two as expected, unmoving and quiet, he continued with another question. "Do you two know how many soldiers I lost in this battle?" Silence. "Do you know why we haven't already started marching to bolster the front's cohort in the southeast?" Neither man said a word, and the Interfector was more than ready to finish answering his own questions. "We took far too many losses to even manage the amount of captives we obtained. Now, Therakos tells me you, Alaron, are just about the most loyal, dependable, competent, tactically minded, and capable warrior under his command. His eyes shifted to Montano. I am also told that you, Montano, are the most savage, vicious, and terrifying commander of any group of veterans out there. Shifting between the two again, he concluded, I wonder if the outcome of this battle might have turned out even a little bit more in Caesar's favor. If 2 of the 6 most dependable commanders weren't too busy fighting each other and sitting here in these little cages. What was sounding like a paternal lecture to anyone else turned deadly serious when the killer's face twisted to ugly rage. Locking eyes with both men, seemingly at the same time, the commander asked yet another question. Do either of you worthless sacks of dog shit know what happens to me if I fail? Even though the decibel of his voice never went into a shout, his face became contorted into that of a demon as the answer poured from his mouth, dripping with blood. I get killed. That's what happens to me. I don't care if Aileron struck you, Montano, on accident, on purpose, or if your assault was justified or not. All I know is that 2 very capable men could have been busy killing a Jones if they weren't too busy killing each other. It seems as though you 2 forgot that you're no longer people. You 2 are tools to serve Caesar, same as us all. But as good as you tools are, it seems as though you may need to be replaced. He paused for a long time after that, waiting for a possible reaction that never came. Aileron and Montano were completely resigned to their fate, and still silently wondering what that was. Finally, the Interfector stated, I don't have the luxury of killing you 2 off. I need every capable man. He saw the 2 men's eyes widen. The killer saw that, and chuckled as it seemed to be what was expected. He gestured his head towards Thericos and Gula behind him, without breaking sight of the duelists, as he said in a sort of whisper, Do you 2 know what Thericos and Gula said to me? Knowing they wouldn't say anything, he answered himself with the words of their commanders. If they were primes or recruits, we'd put them on a pole. Pausing expectingly, the killer said in a secretive sort of way, I'll be honest with you 2. I'm pretty new to this. I'm sure you 2 heard stories of me, but in the end, all that matters is where I am now. I could have been where you 2 are or killed for what I'd done to Caesar, but he sees potential where many don't, and I see some of that too. I simply don't know how to deal with soldiers who stand out from the Legion ranks. Look around. All those faces are covered. They're all the same in the heat of battle, but I find it strange how the only men to stand out do so in a way that opposes Caesar. He paused for another long time before saying, in a matter-of-fact way, I don't intend to show either of you mercy in any way other than what I'm told is overdue. Standing up, he whistles, and 4 legionaries storm past Gula and Thericos and begin unlocking the cells as the killer continues. I will not make the mistake of mercy again. There was no protest on Aileron or Montano's part as they were pulled out of their cell and bound in chains while the murderer finished. Take them to the posts. All eyes will see this, and you'll learn what my mercy means, even if I have to beat it into you. Sunset. It was just past 2 p.m. when the 2 were hauled out of their cells and tied to a set of thick posts that marked the only thing standing of what used to be an adobe structure for the Ajon spiritual celebrations. Atop the ruins and ash of what remained, and sitting in the center of the 3 largest pens of Ajon captives, the men sat in shackles for 2 more hours as the sun beat overhead, and the Legion officers rounded up any soldier not on essential tasks to form up around the posts. The tiny formation of 50 or so legionaries wasn't a grand audience for the punishment, but all eyes from the pens were on them. Even those of the few dozen legionaries on the perimeters, who could see the spectacle over the masses of tribals all looking the same direction. Once all was in place, the 2 men saw the shadows of their floggers cover them in that familiar shade. The shadows of the punishers grew bigger as they stepped up to the men, and soon felt the backs of their crimson tunics rip open. Neither man was eager or ready for the lashing this time, but neither was protesting in any form either. As their backs began taking in the heat of the setting sun, the floggers stepped away again, and both men turned their heads against the wooden posts to face the other. When the 2 locked eyes once more, they noticed the Interfector standing between them again in front. The world silent. The Interfector towered above the kneeling men, and caught eyes with both men again before saying in his characteristic emotionless way, Montano and Alaron. Both nearly killed in two different fights that shouldn't have even happened. Wouldn't you say it's about even now? Silence, yet again. There was nothing to say to another question that was only rhetorical in the minds of both men. Looking to Alaron, the previous victor recently shown defeat, the Interfector asked Alaron a question directed at both, but mostly to the newly bested. What will you do if I let you go? The situation was even. Alaron had beaten Montano in Gold Canyon, only to be defeated savagely in the two men's most recent encounter. An eye for an eye was the game, and even at this point, the murderer of Phoenix was ready to spare both men from the harm they deserved if they can acknowledge that their conflict could be called even in largely objective eyes. Still, the question wasn't one that Alaron could answer as the pain in his eyes, mouth, and head flared up again. Alaron looked up to the Interfector and made out as much of the man as he could from his swollen purple eyes. He said, in dehydrated resolution to the fact his feelings were something to be destroyed rather than entertained. If you unbind me, I will kill him. Alaron briefly saw the look on the Interfector's face sink in a bizarre way. The murderer of Phoenix was not shocked by the man's insistence on personal pain, but more on the words said. It was as if the words had brought back some kind of image in the commander's mind, but that expression meant nothing in regard to what was to come. Alaron's eyes landed back on Montano, whose face hadn't changed from that glare he'd worn since hugging the post. As both men's worlds were consumed by the other, the final words of the murderer came. I understand completely. We'll see if we can't beat that defiance back out of you. Begin now. The first lash came down on Alaron and Montano at the same time. Feeling the flesh on their backs split at the first blow, the two watched each other in silence. Neither man flinched or shouted at the first crack, or the second, or the third, or the 25th. 30 lashes in and both men's vision began to blur. Their backs were a mess of thick red lines that tore away muscle, broke the fat, and splattered blood into the sands around them. 31, 32, 38, 42. The men could no longer hold their heads up. On the 44th lash, Alaron and Montano could take it no longer and broke their gaze at the same time. The two collapsed into the posts, and the pain continued despite the numbing sensation that came at the expense of nerves being carried away in the bloody mist. 56, 57, 58. Neither could feel anything anymore. Not their hatred for the other, not humiliation, not even the heat of that setting sun, the dryness of their throats, or the pain of the whip. Yet both laid there fallen against their posts and nearly dead when the final 60th crack arrived. Floating in and out of consciousness, the men's minds, rage, and feelings were erased, taken with them in each drop of blood to dot the sands. They weren't even able to think of the encroaching final action that symbolized how a seed of disobedience would never grow again. The mutilated men were only held to the posts by the rope that anchored them when the shadows of the floggers reached into sacks at their feet, scooped up 2 handfuls of salt powder, and stepped closer. With the men forgetting what mercy meant, neither could say anything, protest, or even register what was happening as the floggers slammed their handfuls of salt against the open backs of Montano and Alaron. As the salt landed on the deepest wounds, it worked its way into every crevice and onto every nerve, ending exposed to the world, reawakening both men who let out a horrific scream at the terrible burning. The scream wasn't like anything the watching legionaries, or even the Ajoans in the pens had ever heard. As the salt did more and more of its torturous work on the destroyed men, their scream and shock transitioned seamlessly into a loud, cackling laugh still characterized by the agony being endured. They wanted this. They wanted every ounce of the horrible pain they felt. But still, pain is pain, and the men collapsed unconscious. With both men unconscious and completely broken, their screaming laugh echoed into the wastes long after, and every remaining legionary under the 6th, 5th, and 9th knew the names of the punished. But more importantly, why they were laughing. Pain was something to be laughed at in the face of personal honor, but only if it can be reshaped by beating into glory to Caesar. This was a message neither Montano or Alaron knew they were sending to anyone, but one that became evident in the minutes, hours, days, months, and even years after their punishment. Though their animosity for the other was beaten out of them at those whipping posts, The salt couldn't neutralize what had been growing deeper and deeper roots since that first fight in Gold Canyon. The spirit of personal combat and spilling of blood in the name of glory was realigned by the punishment of Montano and Alaron. The blood and pain renewed the men, and the crack of each blow revitalized their dedication to servitude. In the end, what happened in punishment wasn't enough to eliminate the spirit of what started months earlier, but the lashing marked the start of their impact on the world around them and began their transition to legends across the Legion. Alaron and Montano's fate was set in stone at that point, and what would manifest from their feud was already set in motion.